What's going on, guys? The Comics Kid 2099 here. Welcome to day 75 of the 365-day graphic novel review challenge. Today, I want to talk to you about Excalibur, The Legend of King Arthur by Tony Lee and Sam Hart. This is an alternate take on the legend of King Arthur. It takes a lot of the elements that you are probably familiar with, especially if you're a fan of King Arthur like I am, and it plays them in a slightly different way. For example, this takes the story of Gawain and the Green Knight, and it incorporates it into this larger tale, but it does it slightly differently than the original Gawain and the Green Knight story. And when I first read this, I didn't like that this did that. I wanted it to be a little bit more of a straightforward King Arthur story, but I'm really glad that this book did that now. I have lots of different versions of King Arthur that I can go to, and each one is very different from each other. So I don't have to have this book be the straightforward King Arthur story, if that makes any sense. I really like that this is able to take a lot of those elements that I'm familiar with. For example, the sword Caliburn and the sword Excalibur are both the same sword, but it also kind of uses both versions of the sword's origin story, the fact that it came from a stone and also that Arthur got it from the Lady of the Lake. I really like that it's able to merge those two stories and merge those two swords into one sword in the story and make that work. That's something that John Boorman did in his Excalibur movie, and this book does it a little bit differently than that movie did it, but also kind of sort of going along the same lines. But I really like that this book is able to take all of these big elements that you've probably heard of before if you are a fan of King Arthur, but it gives you a new story. It's familiar territory, but you're also having fun because a lot of this stuff is stuff that you're not necessarily going to expect if you are a big hardcore fan of all these other King Arthur stories, and I really like that. One thing that I really like about this book is that this is able to portray the entire reign of King Arthur and not make this book feel like it's not giving us enough of that. That's one big thing that I usually complain about whenever I see a story try to portray the entire reign of King Arthur. The John Boorman Excalibur movie and the 1998 Merlin miniseries, both of those try to portray 25, 30 years of King Arthur's reign in the span of 2 or 3 hours, and that's just not enough time to portray that much story. This book gets around that a little bit. First of all, it doesn't say that it's 25 years. It kind of implies that it's a little bit less than that, so you're not trying to portray as much stuff going on in such a limited amount of space. But also, this gets around that in different ways in story. For example, after Arthur pulls the sword, he has to go to war with this rival king who's trying to kill him and stop him from ascending to the throne, and Merlin takes him to the other world, the land of the fairies, and Arthur ages like 2 years in the span of one night in the real world. And technically, that's part of Arthur's reign because it's after he pulled the sword. And I think in T.H. White, in The Once and Future King, I believe that's where it's said that Arthur had a 25-year reign, so that kind of works those 2 years into Arthur's 25-year reign. And then at one point, Morgan Le Fay teleports Merlin like 2 or 3 years into the future, maybe even further than that, I can't remember. So this feels like one cohesive story. It doesn't feel like we're having any of these time jumps where it's like, okay, Arthur has now married and there's going to be an era of peace, so let's jump forward 10 or 15 years or something like that, kind of like what the Merlin miniseries or the John Boorman Excalibur movie does. This doesn't do that. This kind of feels like one cohesive story. For example, Mordred, he plays a role in this, and he is artificially grown to adulthood, so we don't have this gigantic span of time that this book is trying and failing to portray. I really like that. This is a really fantastic book for anyone who wants to get into King Arthur. I don't know if I would say that this is a good starting place for people who aren't familiar with King Arthur, but I don't think it's a bad place to start either. But you might want to be just a little bit familiar with some of the elements of King Arthur. Or, if this is your starting place, read this and then familiarize yourself with some of the other versions of King Arthur. Go read other books like prose novels and stuff like that. Go watch some of the King Arthur movies and TV shows, and then come back to this and you will appreciate some of the Easter eggs that this book throws at you that you might not necessarily know anything about if this is your first time with King Arthur. But I really like this book. I cannot recommend it enough. Admittedly, I am a huge King Arthur fan. I am a huge mythology fan, so this kind of stuff is right up my alley, but I still think that it's a worthwhile story, even if you don't love that stuff as much as I do. So those are my thoughts on Excalibur by Lee and Hart. I hope that you guys liked this review. If you did, be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe, and I will be back tomorrow with an entirely different video. In the meantime, you guys have a great rest of the day. Catch you later.